Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Edtech Disruptors. On this episode, we're sitting down with Amir Nathoo, the co-founder and CEO of Outschool. Outschool is an online learning platform designed to empower students ages 3 through 18 to learn on their own terms. It also gives teachers the space to create their own classes, which they don't necessarily get the opportunity to do in their traditional school setting. We talk about a whole magnitude of things, but mostly how the world of education is changing, and not only how Outschool is playing a role in that, but just what we can be considering as both educators, parents, and stakeholders in the education space. I hope that you get a lot of enjoyment from this episode, and I hope it really gets those gears turning for you on what we can expect in the world of education. So, as always, tune in, grab your favorite beverage, pull up a chair, share this with a friend, and let's get ready to do this. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Leena Marie Saleh, the Edtech Guru. I want to thank you so much for spending time with me on this journey, for all the support that you give me, and for following along. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and let's get ready to do this. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Edtech Disruptors. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Amir Nathoo, which is the founder of Outschool. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be talking.
Yes, so great. To kick things off, I would love you to tell everyone a little bit about you and your journey to founding Outschool.
Absolutely. So I've been in tech and software basically my whole career, and I've been an entrepreneur for much of it. And in around 2014, I was thinking about my next phase. And one thing I knew is that I wanted kids. I didn't have kids at the time, but I wanted kids. I knew how hard it was to start companies, a set of motivations to maybe explore that. Um, and I got to exploring ideas where I felt could be integrated with having kids and doing something for them. And that got me reflecting on my own childhood experience and my own experience with education. I was really lucky to have an excellent traditional education in the UK, and also parents who were both teachers for large parts of their career in physics and math. And it was really that reflection, both of my education and also observing where the world was going, and suddenly realizing, actually, in the future and for my kids, I don't think that the best thing for them and what's needed is what I got, despite the fact I had an absolutely excellent education. I can go into why. But I started exploring the edges of education and saying, what are people doing, you know, innovatively? And not just from like a tech standpoint, but in particularly just like a social standpoint. Like, where was traditional education not living up to expectations, and who was doing something different? And I started learning about homeschooling, and in particular gifted homeschooling in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. And that sent me down this rabbit hole where I realized, oh wow, there's something really interesting going on here that's bigger than homeschooling, that's different from what people expect, and I think could be clues about the future of education and what's needed for kids and for society from education in the future. And that led me on this journey.
Such a interesting thing, because I don't think most people think about, oh, I'm going to start thinking. I don't think their first thought is like, oh, I know I want to have kids someday, and what do I want their future to look like? I think oftentimes it's usually identified by like a need that they've seen, or something, I would say, more present day instead of like future planning. So I think that's a really interesting aspect. And I really enjoy hearing that you were like, okay, who's doing things innovatively? What does it look like? And I think San Francisco is probably a really good example of what they're doing in that like homeschool movement. I see actually here when I moved to Texas, they call it the unschool movement, where like, it's a really big saturation of homeschool. But I grew up in Colorado, and homeschooling was just like, often the kids who didn't fit in, or their parents were just too overbearing, that wouldn't let them necessarily go to school. So I think it was interesting to see all the different options and availability that there is for homeschool students, that they're traditionally, in my mind at least, I never thought about.
Totally. And, that was one of the things that really surprised me, because when people talk about homeschooling or think about homeschooling, if they haven't spent a lot of time looking at it. And I think this is actually changing. I think awareness is growing. But people have a kind of a very fixed view of why people do it and how they do it. And some of that is rooted in facts, but those facts are only based on some examples of a small part of the community. And really, it's a little bit of a challenge when thinking about homeschooling, alternative education, and really alternatives to mainstream in general, in that it's got this word homeschooling, and it sounds like a singular word, and people say, and people try and look for patterns. But really, the primary defining feature of homeschooling is nothing to do with home and school. It's that these are families that have opted out of traditional education. But the reasons why and how they do it are massively broad. And probably the only overarching theme that I might, put a stake in the ground, obviously, number one, that they have made the decision to opt out of the traditional system, but they're also doing so out of a choice and personalization. What kind of choices they make are widely varied. What kind of personalization, what's driving that, how they do it, incredibly varied. But choice and personalization are the key to why these families do it. And then, this was one of the realizations. It was like, okay, choice and personalization. Okay, that's a preference for a subset of this market. Great, is there an opportunity there? But then I started to realize, reflecting more widely on the economy, where the world is going, and just what is healthy for our kids, emotionally and practically, that choice and personalization wasn't just about, oh, some parents want this, but I started to develop a belief that it was extremely important for the future. And two core reasons why I think it's extremely important in the future. First, I'll give an economic reason, which is that in the past, in an industrialized economy, the purpose of traditional school was to give people a core set of skills and then kind of rank them against those skills so they could be, sent to these large employers. But in the future, with automation, with the change to the knowledge economy, and now with AI, there's going to be a much more value placed on creativity, entrepreneurship, taking diverse, unique paths. And kids need to develop their own path and be world class in being them. And otherwise, they'll have no differentiation in a globalized, automated economy. And so you are not future proofing your kids' education if you follow the standard ideology in education. One, that's an economic argument. But I don't fully subscribe to education should all be about kind of economics and all we're doing is preparing our kids. Obviously, parents want that. They want their kids to be successful and be economically viable in the world. So that's part of it, but not the only part. Because the other thing parents want in general is they want their kids to be happy and successful, not as a trade-off. And what we see time and time again is that if you give, in various methods of measuring this or various methods of looking at it, that if you give kids autonomy and freedom and ability to make choices and ability to own their education, that increases their confidence and love of learning, and which contributes to their overall well-being. And so there's, in my view, a human ethical argument and an economic argument as to why choice and personalization is very important in education.
Yeah, I think you're speaking everything that speaks true to my heart is the ability for personalization. I think in the world, we just think about how the world of work has just evolved. I would say, like, just in the last pandemic to now, people, the traditional way of people going to work was just waking up, taking the drive, going to work, showing up, doing it, and leaving. And then throughout the transition of the pandemic and where we are, 5 years later, is the way that we work is way different. A lot of people work in hybrid spaces. Communication is always on. It's not as traditional as it used to be, and you're always having to live in this world. But I think the most important thing is we're adopting AI, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's more that creativity that is a differentiator for a lot of people, that creativity and that problem solving skill set, and personalized learning and letting kids own their learning contributes to that ability to problem solve and creativity. And those are world-class skills that all industries are looking for. We can see in any report written by big businesses, big media, whatever. And that's really important, that like choice is not only for the parents, but choice is for the students, and the students having choice and how to make the right decisions, and maybe even sometimes failing, which is totally fine. And maybe they take a no thank you taste of something. But those are really important factors to our students succeeding in a world that outlives us.
Totally. Yeah, 100% in alignment with that. And, and that's what I think is really challenging. I mean, as a parent or as an administrator in education, to think about what the goals really should be. And for a long time, I think people were able to kind of really ignore that introspection because there was a traditional default system that seemed by and large to work. And why introspect in that way? Why not just adopt the typical societal goals for education, accept those, save yourself a lot of headache and heartache, and broadly speaking, it worked. But the problem now is that parents en masse do not believe that their kids will be happy and successful only if they follow the standard path and do everything right by the standard playbook. Standard playbook being, pick a good school, try and get to a situation where your kids have good grades or excel in some area. Have them go to college or go to trade school and develop a profession or a craft. And then there'll be employers waiting at the end of that journey for them. They'll be able to afford a family and a house on potentially a single income if they want, and they'll be happy and successful for life. Many parts of that journey are completely broken right now, completely broken. And you can go into the economic and political parts of this, but to narrow the focus to education, the core problem is that belief is gone. That you just get good grades, you go to college, and you're going to be fine. No one believes that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're right, is that we didn't have to do as much of that. Like, we could just schools could continue operating in the way that they were operating because the output was what they deemed to be the same, essentially, and hadn't really changed. But in the last 5 years, the world of work has changed so immensely that that traditional path doesn't make sense. We can obviously we could dive in whatever way we want to go, but the traditional school system and why we're seeing the result of a lot of parent choice and a lot of um, there's two things. Parents were invited into the school place during COVID and the pandemic. And so they had more like transparency into what their students were doing and how they were achieving and that sort of thing. And then as soon as everyone went back, they kind of closed that door. But what the problem often with education is that most people who spend space in education have only ever been educators. And that is fine in the sense of when you continue going that way, because there isn't the understanding of what businesses do, how they work, and how they operate. They only know it in one linear system. And so as school leaders, when they're making these decisions, they're only operating in that frame of mind that they know and that they know true. But the problem is that parents know something different oftentimes, or they're seeing something different. And so we're kind of seeing this for the first time, I would say, in like a while. So we're kind of seeing butting of heads happen. And obviously with the Department of Education and all the things kind of coming through and changing. But I think for the first time, we're really seeing parents wanting to play a bigger role in understanding that schools aren't. And me as a parent, I also understand, and having been a former educator, that I also understand that the school take 100,000 years to change, and they don't change as fast as the world of which we're working. And so I know that I'm going to have to provide alternative opportunities for my child outside of what they're learning in the school system.
100%. And I think one of the challenges with these kind of system changes is that it's easy to get to the blame game or to have it be over politicized, which plenty of people are attempting to do. But the thing is that, at least, when I talk to administrators, teachers within schools, there's wide agreement on the kind of things that are good for kids. It's not like there's a massive kind of ideological difference here. And what I see is teachers and administrators laboring within constraints that make it impossible for them to do what they really want to do.
Yeah.
And funding is part of it, but not the only part. I see stats where there's large amounts of teacher vacancies across the country. In the tech world and startup world, there are startups focused on training new teachers and bringing them in as immigrants from abroad to try and close this gap. Why is that happening? It's a lot of it's about conditions and pay and not really being able to do what they want to do. They wanted to
Mhm.
teach kids, but feel hamstrung within the
Mhm.
constraints of the existing system. But where is that hamstring coming from? And there's a lot of emphasis placed on the economics, and that's for sure part of it. But part of it is when you have big, large scale system change, what happens is everyone tries to people kind of panic, and they also try and cling on to what they knew, and this causes politicians and governments to say we have to go back to basics. The problem here is not the teachers aren't working hard enough, or we need better standards, or they're not teaching math like they used to. And all of this is a typical reaction to when people feel out of control.
Mhm.
It was better then. Let's go back to what we know. And then parents, because they're rising anxiety because of all the changes in the world and their care for their kids, are demanding changes on a system, but there's no unifying force behind the change because it turns out what every family wants is different. And in fact, it changes with time and changes with circumstance. And there's no more, there maybe used to be a societal consensus about what education was for and how it should be delivered. There is no societal consensus anymore. It's completely destroyed, but we haven't really internalized what that means. They're still trying to kind of get this system to do what we want, even though there's no consensus about what that purpose actually is. And so when I see these policy discussions and the politics around it, it's all about, in my view, it's all a sideshow. Like no
Mhm.
one's actually talking about what do we do about this problem? Well, A, what is education for? Is there any consensus about what it's for? And at what level is it? Is that consensus? And as a result, how should we retool the system? And so I come back with what I observe, which is that there is no consensus at the level of what subjects or exactly how it's going to be delivered. There is quite a lot of consensus that there needs to be choice, there
Mhm.
needs to be customization. That's important for the future, both economically and for kids' well-being. And that's why so I'm happy to talk about all the politics, all the specific issues, but I also think a lot of it's a sideshow.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And there's no there's just not a good framework for how they're going to do that. And so yes, you're right. Teachers and administrators, everybody knows it needs to change. However, you're confined to a certain system that like you can't, it's almost impossible to climb out of the system because of the way that the system has been structured and the standards that are there that hold them in this lock. So I just think it's really interesting. But you're right. I think everything does come back down to choice and being able to have that ability. And there is no really there's a really lack of choice for even educators and for administrators to be able
Yeah,
to do that. And I don't think we have. I wish we had a really good answer of what we're hoping that we want our students to be able to do by the time they get out
yeah,
of 12th grade. And I don't think that we know quite yet what that looks like. And because of that, we're seeing just this discombobulation and panic, complete panic from everybody around what's going on in today's world and what's going to happen with our students.
So I've got, there's a lot to be pessimistic and sad about here. And I've got one additional comment on that front, but I've actually got three areas of hope that I also wanted to highlight. The kind of sad and difficult point is again when there are these times of large scale system change and even system failure, it's going to be rough. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to be rough for the next 3 to 5, however long years. And I think kind of accepting that as people in the education industry, it's not just education, by the way, but
Yep.
but it's going to be rough. But there are multiple areas of hope in my view. One of which is you might be thinking, oh God, if everything's breaking, everything's changing, I need to make like radical choices as a kid, but I don't feel able to like do this thing that Amir is talking about, like alternative education or homeschooling. You don't need to. You can, but you absolutely don't need to. So I have a 6-year-old. I'm not a tiger parent. I can go into what my kind of goals are when I think about my kids' education. But he does 30 minutes of math tutoring a week, 30 minutes of reading tutoring, and he has his Minecraft social group and some other extracurricular activities. And he goes to a very alternative, self-directed slash project-based learning micro school in San Francisco. And with those small extra supplements to ease any concern about keeping up in traditional subjects, he goes ahead of grade level. And it's very small interventions or can have massive impacts. This isn't like necessarily you need to upend your life in order to make a lot of progress with your child, either in core subjects or in preparing for career or against any of these issues. It can be relatively small incremental changes. So that's one area of hope. Another area of hope is that in order to deliver choice and personalization, there is school choice, this idea that we should allow people to choose between schools and also even take the kids out of school, and that should be normalized. Great, and I agree with that. But that doesn't necessarily mean schools are going to go anywhere or don't have a massive role. It's just that within schools, I expect there needs to be a process of unbundling, where what if schools that are struggling with enrollments and finances were to start offering extracurricular activities, their after school programs, not just to families who enrolled full time in the school, but to their communities? Is there a way to do that with even some of the academic classes? Because people who have opted to opt out of the school system actually then have massive challenges in access to some of these services, and would love it if the school gave them an option to not necessarily show up every day full time like the typical enrollment patterns, but allow them to participate in those after school sports. And we see the start of some of that in some areas, but it's very, very early. And schools have a massive role to play in choice of personalization. It doesn't just mean opting out of schools. That's my second area of hope. And then thirdly, I've said there's no consensus right now. That doesn't mean there can't be consensus. I just think it needs to happen at a different level of abstraction than subjects and grades and college entry. And I have two proposals about what the goals for education should be. And one of them is, what do you want? Like, let's visualize this kid who at 18 or 21 or whatever you want to consider kind of formal education typically ending. Like, what do we want? And, here's what I want for my kids. And here's what I think could be interesting to other parents. I want them to love learning. I want them to feel confident. I want them to enjoy the process. I want them to be comfortable with failure and experimentation and risk taking. I want them to love learning. Because if they love learning, I don't have to worry about what knowledge and skills they have and whether that's still going to be applicable into the future. I can feel confident that they're going to be able to adapt because they can learn. They love the process of learning. They're confident in it. They've experienced it. The second thing I want for them is to have a world-class portfolio in something, in some area, both to have experienced what it takes to get mastery in a particular area and to have demonstrated that mastery to others through a portfolio. And maybe that's the thing that turns the career, but not necessarily just getting to the point of having a world-class portfolio in some area in anything, I think is the main goal. And I think those two goals map to my ideas of how to ensure that they are happy and successful. And I have no idea if anyone shares those goals, but I wanted to offer that as potential goals for future education.
Yeah, I really like that because you're right. The love of learning is something that just never it never leaves you, and you can find right. That's why YouTube has become what it's become, right? Because people go there really quick for quick bites of information, or TikTok, which now my grandma's on TikTok, which is crazy. She's like, I want to learn something. So she goes to TikTok, which is mind blowing to me, right? But you're going to find this like new information. And so people are always going to want to know how to find new information. And it's that love of learning and learning how to do it well, I think is important, because I think you can easily go down rabbit holes and learn things that don't really have much truth to them, I think, but
Yeah.
I think it's the love of learning and how to do it well, I think is like a really important aspect, because you're right, they're never going to have all of the skills and all of the information that they're going to need for the world. My son is 1. You said your son 5 to 6?
6. Yeah.
6.
Yeah.
They're not going to, the world of which they're going to live in is different than the world is right now. So they're never going to fully have the skills or the knowledge necessarily for everything. But if they know how to do the learning and how to find the information and seek it, then you're right. As parents, we've done our job and we're just like, okay, we know they're going to thrive and they're going to be able to succeed. with just those few things. And I think, it's interesting you said the mastery of something, because that's actually not something that I've necessarily just myself like thought too much about. Like, do they have a mastery in like a skill? I think about them loving the learning and knowing how to like do all those things. But I think the mastery is like is an important, like, I like that distinction. I think that's just not something necessarily we think about, because even with the education system, right? Like, you're good you take little bites of everything, but you never really become a master of one thing.
Yeah, and I think the key distinction between, I guess, my proposal and some of which we talk about outcomes and achievement and mastery within traditional education is the idea of the portfolio as the output, not the test. I
Yeah.
think that's really, really important. And having direct observability about your abilities that is more real than tests, which in many ways are fake representations, and are subject delineations or traditional subject delineations, which are human created. It's all human created, but created a long time ago and not necessarily applicable in the world of the future, or as applicable in the world of the future. It's also a really interesting point that you brought up about, our kids being young. And so the love of learning piece is really important because we don't know what kind of world they're going to grow into. And I would also argue that that's even more important today than it has ever been. And, this is where tech comes in and the changes in the world that are driven by tech and now AI. In the tech world, we see charts about how technology adoption and the impact of technology is accelerating. And so the and that has an impact on society. And so a key revelation for me was when someone said, today, right now, is the slowest rate of change that we'll experience in our lifetime. It's going to be faster tomorrow and faster in the future. And if you really internalize the concept that this isn't like just, oh, things are kind of unstable and volatile right now and it kind of feels out of control, but this is going to accelerate, then it starts to make you really humble about making predictions. Like, oh, I know what kids are going to need to learn. I'm very nervous about any assertions like that because acceleration makes it incredibly hard to predict. And then if you believe that it's incredibly hard to predict, that's when you need to go up a level of abstraction and start to realize, okay, it doesn't really matter what the particular subject is or the particular goalposts. What does matter? It matters that they can learn. It matters that they know how to learn, they feel confident in learning, because the specific skills and knowledge might be irrelevant very, very quickly. And that brings me back to those kind of higher level, more abstract goals.
Yeah, I agree. So we've talked a lot about that. Now, tell us a little bit for those of us who, I'm sure most of our listeners have heard of Outschool, but I'd love for you to tell everyone a little bit about it, and then we can talk about the integration of those two things.
Absolutely. So Outschool is an online learning platform, and we provide a marketplace of live online classes for kids. So these are classes that range from core academics through enrichment, through career development, everything that teachers are creative and inspired to create. We have thousands of teachers and over 100,000 classes on the platform for kids aged 3 through 18. They happen in small groups or one-on-one tutoring. And the idea behind providing this tremendous variety in this online format is that we can allow for people to take incredibly diverse paths and to find exactly what their kid needs, given their personal motivations. For example, you have a kid who's struggling to get interested in math, but a parent who's worried about that. You have Learn Math Through Minecraft that a teacher has created on the platform. You want to help your kid with financial literacy. There's a class for that. You are concerned about social emotional learning and your school's ability to provide that because of maybe their over focus on academics. There are social groups, there's debate clubs, there's even music lessons. I didn't think music would necessarily be an area that online learning could work at, but my son and daughter, she's 3, they take piano classes on Outschool. You put the computer next to the piano and the can see the fingers. It works. And it's convenient and it's lower cost than typical in-person education. You don't have the transport, you have to pay for the physical location. And teachers all over the United States and in fact in other countries around the world are suddenly able to teach the classes they've always wanted to teach to an audience who is really receptive. We work with a lot of homeschoolers and people in alternative education. We also work with a lot of families who are into these ideas that we've been talking about, customizing education, but are starting with supplementing school. We work with a lot of families with neurodivergent kids, whether it's diagnosed or not officially diagnosed, and the kind of flexibility and variety really allow us to serve all those communities. So we've served over 1 million learners worldwide at this point, and we're really just getting started because, for the most part, we're focused on our initial markets of US and North America, and have only made a start there, let alone expanding globally. But what we hope to create is this really significant global community where everyone worldwide with K-12 age kids can find what they want.
Which I think is really great. I'm going to say two things just while you're talking. Is I've known a lot of teachers who have actually come to Outschool and they're like, oh, it's made me love teaching again because they get the ability to teach what they want. Also make a little bit of money, which is also helpful for them too. But I think that that's really important. But I also think the nice thing about this type of learning is that it's small group instruction, and so you get the chance to you can just have deeper, richer learning, but you also can connect sometimes with people around the world. And we do live in a very digital world. Like everyone, I work at Canva, and the bulk of my team sit in Australia. So like we're constantly, having to have conversations around the world. I have team members that are in the Philippines. So it is a global world that we're living in. And by giving them opportunity to connect in a digital space safely with an educator who's passionate about what they're doing and, bringing that love and joy of learning to students, it's also giving them skills for that life that we don't know what's going to exist, but we do know that everyone is going to be very digitally connected, way more than we ever thought possible for ourselves at one point in time, when we were on the MySpace back in the day, thinking that was cool, or AOL, ASL,
Totally.
that sort of thing.
We're showing our age. I remember that era.
Yeah. Oh, good times. Oh man, only kids knew what it was like to wait for the internet to dial up.
That's the other thing about
your life.
technology. I just when I got into computers when I was young, obviously no one was yet concerned about screen time or social networks. Like, oh my god, like my parents had no idea that I was playing computer games all day. And there was this thing called CompuServe in the UK. I was like chatting with strangers on the internet.
I know.
I'd be horrified. And there needs to be some limits on this, but I also think there needs to be some trust. Because the reality is, whatever adult imposed limits on technology are, kids are going to get very quickly better at technology than adults. So, I don't advocate for a free for all, but I think some of the commentary about technology and kids is, again, reactionary, emotional, pseudoscience in many cases. And there needs to be some balance to it. That it's actually a value to provide kids access to the modern tools of society that they grew up in. And often it's the adults who get really messed up by the new technologies. I mean, we could talk about Facebook and politics and the rest of it more than the kids. And so I think, again, a little bit of humility and a little bit of balance when it comes to that aspect is important.
Yeah, I think so too. I think just like embracing technology. I think oftentimes, like my younger sister, my nephew was in school, and she purposely put him in a school that didn't have access to technology. And then when he did go to a public school that did have technology, he really just like suffered with the way that, learning how to like adapt to that world. But I don't think he suffered as hard as she thought he was going to suffer, because they're just like quick learners. I even just think about my son the other day was FaceTiming with my mom, and he was pushing buttons and teaching me things that I didn't even know existed. I'm like, well, how did he push that? Like, how did he figure this out? Yeah. How did he figure out how to call grandma? But like, that's just the world that they will live in. So it's important that we do have trust. And I think our role and the role of, giving them this space in online learning is that we are showing them how to trust and how to do it, just like learning well, how to do it well so that they can navigate those spaces. Because you're right. Back in the day, we were in chat rooms talking with total strangers, asking them ASL in a chat room, or downloading music, which doesn't even make any sense. Getting these like BitTorrent
Yeah,
files down between us, not knowing what was going to happen between us. And we came out fine, but there's lots of learnings that we can
yeah,
help to secure our kids with in a world where which they will be
totally.
way faster digitally than we ever thought about being.
Totally. And that's part of what we're trying to provide with Outschool, right? A safe space that's educational, and these rooms with a teacher, supervised, and we have a trust and safety team and, visibility into everything and what's going on in class. And so it's not like, a free for all part of the adult internet, which, as we know, has some pretty dark corners. So, not all screen time is created equal, and not all online spaces are created equal. And what we hope to be is a stepping stone where kids can have access to technology through these classes, both studying technology, we have classes about that, but also just participating in this format is part of that. That gives them the taste of the power of these tools while being in a safe space. And over time, teaching about internet safety, about misinformation, and opening all that up. And the truth is, I think the, the next generation of kids is a lot more savvy about misinformation and about safety than we ever were when we were first experimenting with early versions of the internet. So there is good progress there.
Yeah, crazy to think back. We won't bring up old stories of the worlds of the dark worlds of the internet, but yeah, I think the safety is the biggest piece about that. We talked a little bit before we logged online. Is a, a lot of you began this journey years ago, and then the pandemic happened, and everybody was coming obviously to Outschool, and we saw a lot of other platforms who offer similar things, become very, very big and then burn out really, really quickly. And so, how do you think Outschool has been able to kind of navigate that change of, everybody was online and everybody wanted their kids to do 9,000 things because they were busy and they needed them to do other things. And then we're kind of seeing the precipice of parents really understanding that role of personalized learning and how it is important in their kids' lives. So how have you kind of adapted and kind of changed with that journey of
Totally. And
emergency to
I,
now?
yeah, no, it was a crazy time.
Yeah.
We our business grew something like 16x in 1 year, which is like unprecedented at the scale we're at. It was obviously an emergency situation and a unique situation. I'm very proud of how we responded and were able to help so many families with that. But the thing is, we're in this for the long run. And we founded the company in 2015, so we were serving alternative education many years before the pandemic, and we focused fully on live online classes till 2017. So it's not like we were like, oh, like suddenly there's a business opportunity, everyone seems to want this online learning thing, we're going to do it. The reason we were there in 2020 when the pandemic happened and were able to serve so many families is that it's all the underlying theses that I've already talked about, which were already trends that were happening before the pandemic and after the pandemic continue to happen. Everything I've said about the need for choice, the need for a future-proof education, the changing definitions of what families want and how we can help them, help their kids be happy and successful. None of that is kind of like only in the pandemic. So I think some part of what you saw with these companies that came in and were flameouts was, reacting to the seeming short-term trend versus the long-term. And also some of it's always in these circumstances when there's the very quick changes, just difficult operating environments, and it's difficult to operate a company in an environment where there's so much volatility. And we were very fortunate to be able to take a long-term view and to capitalize the company very well, and then weather the return to school, which did result in a downturn in online education, but now growing again because of all the long-term trends that we've always been focused on. So, I think those have been the key parts of it. I think are probably general truths to operating in edtech. You have to be in it for the long game. These relationships with families and kids can last for years and years. but there's a high trust barrier, and you better know what you're doing and have a future oriented perspective. Um, and so, I think those are things that we've done well on. There's plenty of mistakes and things we did badly on, and plenty of things we tried. One thing I wish could have gone better, and I still have high hopes for the future, is during the pandemic, as well as dealing with a lot of consumers coming to us and a lot of people coming to us through our non-profit initiatives to give these classes free to families in need, we also tried to partner with schools. And there was a lot of motivation for schools to partner with us. But unfortunately, we couldn't really get it to work at that time because the logistical difficulties of having large classes all participate in online classes at the same time, either because they're co-located and are taking different classes, or you're trying to get a whole class room, were just too large to overcome in the timeframes. But I think that's where schools need to go, start to integrate online learning and more choice into the school day. It's going to take some time, both organizationally from a school perspective and in terms of the kind of products that we can produce that really fit that need.
It's funny that you said that, because I was just going to say that you operate more in a B2C model, and I was wondering if you had navigated to a B to B model. So that's interesting to hear that that was like one of your biggest learnings. But I think we'll start to see that. I was just recently listening to some of the South by Southwest keynotes and just the different conversations that they were having, and like Unbound Academy and like some of those like schools, or Alpha School was a lot of the conversation that were being had, actually, like a lot of the topics that they were talking about. And those people who don't know that, we've talked about this before, but it's just more of the school system is they do the bulk of their core competencies online, and then they do all of their like, I don't know, personalized learning in person by doing like tasks and things that bring them like the passion. I think my hope is that we start to see some of that happen, where there are groups of classes who want to take, maybe they are struggling learners. And so they put the struggling learners together and they do, math and Minecraft, things that like pair them with things that are fun, because oftentimes those students who are struggling don't get to do the fun and don't get to participate in the fun. But there is that opportunity with Outschool, and the teachers who are, they're excited to be there and they want to be teaching this to the students, getting that personalized instruction in a different way that maybe the teacher can't necessarily provide, but the teacher can provide the things that are she or he find joy in, and that they get the opportunity to teach to students through that choice.
Absolutely. That's so important. When in the discourse about, oh, why do some learners struggle, people talk about the quality of the teaching, they talk about the curriculum, but not enough times do we talk about student engagement, and not in a pejorative sense. Oh, they just don't want to learn. That's not the case. I think sometimes people get hung up on this idea of like learning should be tough. It was tough for me. Like, it should be a struggle. No, it should be fun. There's nothing wrong with teaching math through Minecraft. There's nothing wrong with making it fun and interesting for the kids. That's just good teaching. And also, people talk about skills and we have the right teachers. Well, but what about teacher morale? Like, when you have a teacher who's like absolutely loving it because they have the freedom to teach the way that they wanted to teach, it's fun for teachers to teach math through Minecraft too, not just fun for the kids. And if you embrace that, this idea that kids should be engaged, that it's good for it to be fun, that teachers should be having fun too, because if they're loving it, that transmits, that enthusiasm is infectious. Then you're going to get better results. And so that's the input. Engagement is the input. Kid engagement, teacher engagement is the input, and then the output is results. But if you focus too much on the outcome alone without paying attention to those key inputs, then you're not going to get the outcomes that you want.
No, I think that's what we're really seeing though across like across the landscape, and why those conversations are happening is we forget, even like during the pandemic, where a lot of students did actually thrive. It may not have had a direct correlation to the test because we weren't teaching to the test, because that's what we were doing before, is literally spending hours and hours and hours and months and months and months practicing test questions so that they could pass the test, which they weren't doing in the pandemic. So actually in my mind and my thinking is that while the test scores decreased, the students' skills in other areas increased. And they were, for the first time, feeling, in my opinion, for the most part of the conversations that I've had with educators around the world, not only were teachers starting to feel joy again because they had the space to create and bring in things that they felt passionate about, but the students were also feeling that morale coming in to the classroom. And I actually think students walked away with more enrichment than we like to allude to, just because the direct correlation of teaching to the test didn't play out how we thought it might play out.
I think that's right. And I do worry that, with some of the results that we're seeing, that there's going to be a reactionary tendency back to traditional methods, which aren't going to work at scale. And in fact, will exacerbate the problem. And, I also think we have to understand that there's a hangover from the pandemic. Kids aren't okay, arguably parents either. And that hangover persists. And again, when there's all this rhetoric about, the kid mental health crisis being purely about screens or about social media, I'm like, oh my God, yes, there's a correlation, but did you see the other factors? Do we remember that millions of people died and kids, not only did parents get visibility that was unprecedented into their kids' lives at school, but kids got visibility into what happens in these emergencies in society and some of the dark sides of that. And teens aren't blind in particular. They see all this stuff. They see how the adults are acting. They see how their leaders are acting and the example that they're setting. And it's not good. It's not good. And there's so much we could talk about with respect to that, but education, the broad point is education fits into a society. It's not disconnected from a society. You can't look at it in isolation. And these trends are connected. And honestly, I offered some hope from the education standpoint, but I wish I had a more positive message from a societal standpoint, because I think we're going to be in for a very challenging environment for the next few years.
I also think so as well. And, it's interesting that you brought up the mental health of students not being correlated to screen time, because I think that's often what we think it is, but it's into the parents. And wasn't like alcohol sales at like an all-time high during the pandemic. So also parents are at home and they're day drinking and they're doing all sorts of things that these students are seeing, or, they're seeing their parents also be in this like very unhappy state. So it does affect everything in a greater bubble than we thought. And I do agree with you that the fallout wasn't just over in a couple of years. Like it is still, they're still living that space where, we never grew up like that. We didn't have like a whole entire world shut down
Right.
and just like stop operating. That's just like not something where people are afraid to go outside or touch their
Yeah.
neighbor's door, or, just anything that like we live in. That's a really hard mental state, I think, to break.
100%. I wish there was more kind of understanding and discussion about that rather than kind of brushing under the carpet. Yes, the acute version where there was that high death rate from the pandemic is probably over. That doesn't mean that the impact of it is over. And there's ongoing, challenges like, economic challenges that parents face that can be masked, because there are some parts of the economy that are doing incredibly well and some people who are doing incredibly well. And there are large parts that are not. And when you have that bifurcation, the average might look stable or standard, but the people's experience is not. And that affects kids. It doesn't just affect the adults.
Yeah, totally agree. One last component before we wrap up today is just talking about, obviously we've talked a lot about technology and I love this conversation. It hits deep in my soul. But how has Outschool adapted to the role of AI in learning? And have you seen that reflect any of the, classes that are being offered, or just like, I don't know, maybe panic or certain things that parents are looking for with result to that?
There's a lot to be said on AI, so I'll try and keep it short. I think one part of AI, which is less talked about, again, is the societal impact. Again, this is a technology that is radically changing the world of work and accelerating change in general in the world, and making traditional education seem more and more out of date faster than it was before. So generally acts to increase parent anxiety about the future for their kids, and so acts towards parents wanting more choice and ability to customize. So even before you talk about all the typical things that people talk about, which is like can we build an AI tutor, or how can AI be used to improve results or decrease cost in education? There's that fundamental societal driver, which this is just another step along the long lines of technology that has accelerated this trend. But then, of course, there's the massive opportunities, which is in efficiency, saving teacher workload. We've got a teacher assistant tool within our platform that makes it easier and faster for teachers to take their notes on feedback and turn it into concrete reports for parents, as just one example of features. We have other ones which are like provide guidance counseling for families to help them navigate choice, because when you have a lot of classes that you could take, how do you pick which one? So all that kind of tooling, it just makes things more efficient and more effective, and I'm very excited about. I think the big question is it possible for AI to replace human teachers? Is that desirable, and does it work? And there's been a lot of flashy demos, and there's a lot of attempts at innovation along those lines. I think my perspective is I think it'll work to a degree in some areas, like language learning practicing. I think Duolingo is doing a great job of using AI, and it's an obvious place where, yes, AI can really make a learning process more efficient. And we're going to find dozens, hundreds of those kind of areas. Fundamentally, though, I think parents are going to continue to want humans involved in their kids' education. I don't think it's any parent's dream that their kid just sits in front of a computer until they're 18 and then they know everything they need to know. Part of it. Let's make parts where technology is applicable more efficient, and that can free up time for the kids to be outdoors, for the kids to be talking to other humans all over the world and all over the country, to be doing enrichment. So let's use the best of both worlds is my take on where we should take the AI tutor idea.
Yeah. I really like that. I think that AI definitely will have its play. I don't think that, even me as a parent thinking about my kid from now, like, do I want him only to be learning from AI bot? I think it's interesting, but I still want the opportunity of playing outside. Like, it was just spring break around here and there's hardly any kids outside. They just it's just like not a thing that like happens today. And I just think that we need to have opportunities that aren't necessarily in front of a screen, even for ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Like, how much time do we spend in front of the computer? So much time.
Totally.
It's crazy. So I
And
think,
I have an online learning platform, but
yeah. So think about it.
I'm not trying to sell the idea of spending all this time in front of the screen. The fact that I know I can get great math tutoring and additional reading tutoring for my son online through Outschool means I feel even more comfortable making alternative education choices for him for his core schooling. It works that way around. It works to enable more outdoor time,
I agree.
more project-based learning time, more self-directed time, while taking care of any parent concerns, which may or may not be valid, but you're covered.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I was also just thinking about how much education will change with the role of AI. Like, AI, this isn't like super new. It's just how fast people have been able to like adapt this. So like it's just changed in the way that we're accessing and receiving information. It becomes your Google search engine for a lot of things that you're hoping to learn. But I think if I'm interested to see what happens with the change of AI for how teachers and educational institutions are leveraging it to do what you just said, the feedback and being able to prepare reports for parents so there's more transparency for
Yeah,
what they're seeing, and how that will affect the role of education itself in becoming more personalized for students to get what they
yeah,
need from the education experience.
absolutely. And it makes many of the trends that I've been talking about more acute, and makes the need for engagement and love of learning to be a primary driver and goal more acute. Because when you set a kid homework, you can't police what's in their hearts. And there are some
Mm-hmm.
kids who want to do it not because they have to, but because they're really inspired by the subject and they want to learn and know this is an exercise. And there are others, many, unfortunately, in the traditional system, who see it as a chore that they just have to get through it because otherwise their parents will shout at them or a teacher will be disappointed. And you can't police what's in their hearts. And you can only motivate and try and get more kids into the inspired category. And if you have AI tools, policing is going to fail. Kids are too smart. The tools are developing too fast. If the kid wants to cheat at homework, they're going to cheat at homework one way or the other, whether they have been, whether this tool exists or not. And so engagement, again, becomes the most important thing. How can we make learning and education relevant to the kids? How can we make more kids excited about it? If they're not excited about a subject, how can we get them excited about the subject? Or let them take a different path. But above all else, let's not damage their global love of learning. Because if that gets damaged, you've done them a massive disservice. And that's why I'm so focused on that love of learning and student engagement message.
Yeah, and I think I know this, and I know that to be true. Teachers have found their love again for teaching and learning, and I think that this provides a lot of students with the opportunity to love what they learn, and I think that's important too. If you had to leave us with one takeaway, or maybe something that one thing that Outschool is working on, is there anything that you would want to leave the audience with, like a last, I don't know, hot take or a little tidbit for today?
Interesting. Well, if we're talking about Outschool specifically, I would just say the summer's coming. You might have made summer camp plans already or not. Either way, everyone's an alternative educator over the summer. And, I'm sure you want your kids to be free to an extent and be outside. And you probably know that, they're going to need some scheduling. They're going to need to be engaged in something so they're not in front of YouTube or their game all day. And I'll just suggest, if you're worried about learning loss over the summer, then I bet we have a fun math class that even kids who don't typically enjoy math will enjoy. Or if you want kids to stay up to date with the latest technology, then try an online camp with us that can fit around all of your in-person schedules. And people don't realize how much, they think talking about homeschooling alternative education, I don't do that. But the summer, everyone does it in the summer. So I'd love to hear from your listeners and see if there's ways we can help them.
I love that. Well, if they're looking to maybe connect with you or find more information about Outschool, where is the best place to do both?
So outschool.com, we try and make it easy to get started on our websites and provide customer support there. I'm Amir at outschool.com, and I would love to hear from you directly, either if you want to use Outschool or if you have ideas about our product and mission. And I'd love to hear from your listeners, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Amazing. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Like I said, this speaks true to my soul, and just really appreciate your viewpoints and for you taking time out of your very, very busy day to speak with us and share your insights. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. These are such important topics for our kids. So really appreciate you.
Great. Awesome. Well, we will see you guys all next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. You've made it this far. We are so thankful that you're here. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, thumbs up, comment below, and join us for all of our next videos. Thank you so much for joining us as we disrupt education together. See you guys soon. Bye, everybody.